Psalm 8 in the 3rd verse, it reads, "When I consider your heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him?" When we think about this text here, it's pretty easy to see David's insignificance in this whole thought that he's talking about. And when we ourselves, when we consider the physical being of man, we find out how truly small and insignificant we really are. And David felt that way. That's what he's expressing in this psalm here. As he's looking up above at the wondrous creation that God has put before us. And he's thinking, wow, the stars, the moon, all these things. But here I am. Here how small, how insignificant we are. And even when we scale the world and we think about it for ourselves, we can come away with that same feeling as well. And it's not very hard to do. If you took time and went on Google Maps and you just looked at the city limits for Pasadena, that should put it in perspective how truly small we are just compared to the city that we're in at this very moment. And even if you pulled it out and looked at Texas, which Texas is very big, we could still feel how even smaller we are. And if you look at the whole world and the universe that we're in and all the planets and stars that God has put there, we can feel quite insignificant. God, why are we here? What is man? It's a common concept that we even present to our children in the stories that we read to them. You may remember Dr. Seuss, Horton Hears a Who. The whole plot and premise of that whole story is that on this little tiny clover, there's a little speck, and inside that speck, there's a whole group of people living there. It's not too hard for us to realize that we're kind of like that we're that small in this spectrum. We are that tiny. But yet, as the text says here in Psalm the 8th chapter, no matter how small we are, what did it say? That God is mindful of us. Why? Why would God be mindful of us when we are, as we're saying, we're insignificant, we're this small compared to the wondrous things that He has created? Well, God has a purpose for insignificant things, to show His great power. Now notice David, he's going to show this idea of how God is going to show His power through insignificant things. Notice in the first verse of Psalm 8, "Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger." David here is speaking of Jesus' triumphal entry that Jesus would later quote in Matthew the 21st chapter. As Jesus has come into Jerusalem shortly before He is executed, He's in the temple and in the midst there, and there are children who are shouting out before the chief priests and the scribes, "Hosanna to the Son of David." And here Jesus quotes this verse when the chief priests and the scribes, they try and correct these children, saying that it was wrong for them to state what they did, being that Jesus is that Savior, the Son of God. And Jesus says, out of the mouth of babes they have perfected praise, quoting this here, that these children are able to silence the adversary, the avenger, the critic to Jesus. We know that the scribes and Pharisees very much filled that place. And these children, these rather insignificant ones, are speaking volumes to the power that God is showing through these insignificant things, being children. That out of the mouths of babes they have perfected praise, that they are realizing who Jesus is. He does it again, David does with the 8th Psalm in verse 5. Speaking of man here, he says, "For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands." We have been crowned with glory and honor when we are insignificant, when we are in this state where we find ourselves, when we look up at the sky that God has lit up before us every single night. And we feel as insignificant as we are. But David says that we are crowned with glory and with honor. Why? Because God uses insignificant things for glorious purposes. With the children being able to silence those critics of Jesus, with man having dominion over the animal kingdom, the other things that God has created for us to be companioned with on this life, that we have them around us. But yet, what is man? Where does man come from? Why is he here? Where are we going? These are so many questions that different philosophers, that different debaters and scholars, they ask day in and day out, trying to find the meaning for this. And they come to the common conclusion a lot of times, oh, it was just all an accident that we're here. It doesn't mean anything. But yet I feel that we are able to use the Bible to answer all of these different questions that we may have about man and about his origins, that we can clearly see our purpose here. That God has a purpose for us, as insignificant and small as we may be. There's something greater here that we are trying to find, and I hope we'll be able to find that this evening. But first we need to start off with the question simply, what is man? If you look in 1 Thessalonians, the 5th chapter, the Apostle Paul gives an answer to this, really. In 1 Thessalonians 5, and in the 23rd verse, 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 23, it reads, "Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit, soul, and body be preserved blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." He states three very distinct elements that comprise man, that make us up there. We can see that man is a being comprised of spirit, soul, and body. That's not something that we maybe don't know. But notice the order in which he does state those things. Spirit, soul, and body. Being that those first two are speaking to the inward man of us, that inward part of us that we cannot see. And we'll take time to look at those. That first one being that spirit. Well, what is our spirit? In Genesis, the 1st chapter, and in verse 26, we can see the importance of why we do have a spirit inside of us. And if we wanted to think about, to really put a term to spirit, I guess it would fit as that disposition or influence that governs the soul, really, of any person. But notice in Genesis 1 and in verse 26, what God says here as He's creating man. In verse 26 of Genesis 1, "Then God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish and of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created him, man in his own image. In the image of God He created him, male and female He created them." We can see that that inward part of man is what is made in the image of God. That it's who we are. It is what makes us up. It's what comprises that buildup that we're speaking of. It's a key element, one of the main three that Paul stated in Thessalonians. But that spirit is that emphasis of my being, which is created in the image of God. And we can see that in John the 4th chapter, of why the spirit is important, why it is something that we need to understand. In John the 4th chapter and in verse 23, Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus says here, "But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth." Our spirit is something that is given to us by God with a distinct purpose behind it. There's a reason that we do have it that makes us different from all the other creatures that He did create. In that 8th Psalm, if you remember the 6th verse, it stated how man has dominion over the workmanship of his hands, being the other creatures that God did make, well, that are here on earth. There's a difference between us, but why? What is that difference? Well, all animals, they have that breath of life. They have a physical body about them, but that spirit is something that is lacking. That's something that they don't have that we do, that they're not made in the image of God. The Bible shows that clear distinction between the inward man, this inward part of me that we're speaking about, and the physical, and that outward part. They're not the same thing. We can see that God is spirit, and He's never been flesh and bones. In Luke the 24th chapter, after Jesus has been executed and He's risen again on that 3rd day, He's showing Himself unto His disciples. And in Luke the 24th chapter and in verse 39, He says here, "Behold, my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see." For what? "For a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." There's this clear distinction between these two elements, this inward man and the outward man. being that his body is what is comprised of his flesh and bones, as all of us that are in the audience tonight, we have a body about us. We also have a spirit, but we cannot see our spirit. There's a distinction between the two. Our body is not our spirit, and our spirit is not our body. But Paul also mentioned another part to this inward man that I think it's worth taking some time to look at. It wasn't that spirit, it wasn't that body, but rather it was that soul. And if you look in Acts the 4th chapter, with me. Now, most of the time in our New Testament, that Greek word for soul is the Greek word suke. And when we're speaking of our soul, we're talking of something that produces motion within us. Our emotions, our will, our mind, that part that is capable of reasoning within us. That's what we're defining as our soul this evening. That's what we're trying to establish this as. And I think that we're able to show how the soul is what animates the body, what gives motion unto it. In Acts the 4th chapter and in verse 32, read with me here. It says, "Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common." We can see this connection between, in the text here, of heart and soul. Now that heart, a lot of times, can be the mind as we're looking at it. It can also be the compassion that we feel for one another, or the emotion that we do share when thinking about certain things. But as that 32nd verse said, it said that they had all things in common, being that they were determined to share. That was something that they were going to accomplish. Their heart was in this realm of determination to where they felt that it was something that they needed to do, something that they were going to carry out. And that soul here is what is complementing this idea of their heart, that they were determined in that way, that out of compassion that they are willing to share with those who didn't have as much, that they were not going to be stingy with what they have. They're going to make action out of that. And we can see that compassion that they had here in the 32nd verse. And we can see how not only is that something that they had, but yet they're united in it. It's something that was about all of them. They're focused in that, but they're willing to share with others that are in need. This shows us how the heart, how the soul, they're united not only in purpose, but in compassion. They're geared toward this. And when the Bible is speaking of soul, a lot of times it's that passion with which I enliven my body to do, with how I'm going to carry out doing something. If you look in Philippians, the 1st chapter, and in verse 27, I feel like we can better illustrate this idea here. In Philippians 1 and in verse 27, notice what the Apostle Paul says. Philippians 1 and in verse 27, it reads, "Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel." Now remember, in Acts, we just saw how they were joined in heart. But rather here in the church at Philippi, we see a rather different idea, how they're going to be united in the faith of the gospel. And at both ends of this verse, I think it's so very interesting how he states two different ideas being relative to the gospel. That first being that they were to live, that their conduct had to be worthy of the gospel, that their manner of life had to meet up with that of an equal weight. That Greek word axios being something of an equal balance. That the way they lived had to live or match up with the gospel of Christ and the commands that we have there. But then at the end of the verse, he states that they needed to be striving for the faith of the gospel. But what's in the middle of those two things is what really drives this home and shows the importance here, that there's one spirit and one mind that they were to be united in, that they were to be joined in. That spirit there is speaking of that inner part of me, the understanding that I can have, the knowledge about me, that discernment to where I can properly understand something. And he's saying that we know the faith of the gospel and that we're able to be united in it. But when he speaks of that word mind there, that's that Greek word suke. It may say mind, but it's really, that's our soul. That vital force which causes animation. So therefore, that purpose that he's speaking about is that it's going to take place. We're going to be united. Not only do we know it, but we're going to carry it out. There's going to be that action that follows through to where this is all coming together. This is all taking place in this way, that they're going to be strong for the faith of the gospel in knowledge and in purpose. when they're standing fast and they're striving for both the faith of the gospel in both those realms, that's something that they can be united in. That's something that we today can be united in, that we should apply to our lives and think deeply about that. Yes, there's that part of my being that will accomplish the latter when I do know what I need to do. When I have that action, when I am passionate about it, that's something that I'm going to carry out, that I'm going to make sure takes place. Our spirit is united with that knowledge of the faith of the gospel, and our mind is going to take care of it. Our soul is what's going to drive it there. The emotion that comes along with it is what we're trying to look at. But what's my purpose? What am I going to do? What is the action that we're talking about? Well, I'm going to be united in that faith of the gospel, as the text says. Look in Colossians, the 3rd chapter with me. In Colossians, the 3rd chapter, and in verse 23. Colossians, the 3rd chapter, and the 23rd verse. As we said, that word mind that we found in Philippians is that Greek word suke that's typically translated as soul, or the emotion that we're talking about here. But notice in the 23rd verse of Colossians 3, it says, "And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to man." What did we say? That our soul is what enlivens my body in the manner in which I'm going to do something. That drive, that passion that is behind my actions and how they're going to take place in the manner that they do. If that's the case and we're to do it heartily, that's what it's speaking of there. That's that Greek word suke there as well. That I'm going to passionately carry out everything that I do in my life as if it's unto God, our Father. That energizing me to be passionate about what I am involved in. That's what our soul does. That's the purpose that it carries out. But what's the third element that Paul stated in 1 Thessalonians 5? It's our body. And I don't think this is probably the easiest of these to understand, being that it's the only one that we can see, that we are dwelling within our body even today. It's that physical body as we have now. It's simply put as that. In Genesis, the 3rd chapter, in verse 19, we know, let's go ahead and read that. In Genesis 3 and in verse 19. Genesis, the 3rd chapter, and in verse 19. It reads, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." Well, this is God speaking to Adam and Eve, well, to Adam mainly, after they have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, with which they were commanded to not do. And here he's saying that, man, our bodies were made out of the dust of the ground. Well, he's not talking to the woman there, so what's she made out of? Well, she's made out of the rib of his side. And if that rib came from the same substance that he was made out of, being dust, she's made out of dust as well. And that's what happens when we do pass from this life. Our bodies decay to the point where to dust we were formed, to dust we shall return. That's what God's saying here. But yet the important part is that this outward man and this inward man, that they come together, and that is what forms man himself. That's the physical being that we see, that we can view from the Scriptures. But we're a spiritual being, as we can see. We're a physical being, but why are we here? What is the purpose with which I am here on this earth at this very time? Why is man here? If you look in Isaiah, the 43rd chapter, we can find answer to that. In Isaiah 43 and in the 7th verse, notice what the prophet Isaiah says. It reads here, "Everyone who is called by my name, whom I have created for my glory, I have formed him. Yes, I have made him." We're purposed here to glorify God. That's our whole task. That was the reason that we were made. But we failed in that purpose when you think about it. You remember what Romans, the 3rd chapter and verse 23 says, that all have sinned and all have fallen short of what? Of the glory of God. The very purpose, the very reason for which we were created, we fell short in. We missed the mark and we were not able to complete that. And that's how we have failed. But look in Ecclesiastes 12 and in verse 13. Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter, and in verse 13. Notice what Solomon says here toward the end of this book. It reads, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all." Fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. This was our entire purpose for which we were put here. It was our entire goal that we were put here on this earth, to serve God, to glorify Him in our lives as a servant should. But I failed. I made a choice to choose the wrong way. I chose incorrectly, and this leads us to the next idea, that man is a free moral agent, that we have the power to choose. We have the power to decide for ourselves if we are going to glorify God, or if we are not going to glorify God. And when we think about when we're saying a free moral agent, what does that mean? That's talking about the morality that we have within us in that inner man for what we are going to decide to do. That understanding of the essence of things that are good and that are bad, of good and sinful. And we have the ability with God's revelation to know right from wrong. We can understand that. And that's a really good thing that we have this guideline for us, that we can know what is right and what is wrong and what is sinful. That's a blessing that we have, this tool before us to where we can properly understand these things. That freedom that we're speaking of here is a true blessing. But there's still a lot of people that say, well, why do we have this choice? Why do we have the ability of free will to where we can decide what we're going to do? We remember Adam and Eve in the garden when they had the simple command in Genesis 2 and verse 17, "Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, but of every other tree in the garden they were perfectly fine to." That was something that they were allowed to do. But what did they do? They chose incorrectly, of free choice. You remember back in Joshua's time how the people were crying out that they were not going to serve God. And he made that statement of, "Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord." There's been people time and time again who have decided for themselves that they're not going to serve God out of that free will, out of that free choice. But why did God give us that free choice to where He knows that we could be disobedient to Him? He knows that we could choose that we're not going to serve Him. Why would He give us that free choice? There's a reason behind it. And it's because only a free moral agent could glorify God willingly, making that choice to do so. I remember when I was a lot younger, at my grandparents' house, they had sort of a courtyard area in front of their, before you got to the front yard, and it was separated by a very, very tall gate that I was unable to reach when I was that young. And they would always let me go outside and play in the front yard, as they called it. And when I would ask, they would say, you can go outside and play, but you cannot go into the front. You can't go and cross the street. I never would have had the option to go and cross the street if I was never able to get out of that courtyard area, as I stated. But at the same time, if they had given me the chance to go out into the front yard where the street was located and I did not go across the street, they would have probably been pretty proud at that. That would have been something that they would have been glorified and encouraged to see, that I was willing to understand that command and process it and apply it and carry it out. But yet, if we don't have the chance to have free will about ourselves to where sin is something that we can't even choose wrong, then how would God be glorified? How would that proper and right choice be something that He would be pleased with if He said, well, you're really just robots. You can't choose incorrectly. That's not what He purposed us here for. He purposed us here to glorify Him. How do we glorify Him? By choosing correctly what we're going to do. By serving Him to the fullest capacity with which we have in our lives today. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand, that they can't see. But if that's the case, and that we have sinned and we have fallen short, where is man going? What's our state now? Well, simply put, we're going to the grave. If you look in Acts, the 2nd chapter, and in verse 27, Acts, the 2nd chapter, and in verse 27, we can see what really happens when this physical life, this life that we're living here on earth, when it does come to an end. Peter, in this sermon on the day at Pentecost, he says here in the 27th verse of Acts 2, he says, "For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption." Well, he's speaking of Jesus here. That Jesus' body, when He was killed, we know He was raised up again that third day and brought back to life. But His body was in that tomb. But where was his soul? It says his soul was in Hades. Jesus died, and his soul was separated from his body. We remember the rich man and Lazarus in that story when they both died and they were carried off, and Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom, and the rich man was over in torment, as the text says. So we can see that everyone is going to Hades, but yet there's going to be a separation there for those that did serve God, that did glorify Him during their time here, but as well as there's something else for those who didn't choose to live that way, to where their lives were something that was not glorifying God, but rather wrong in His eyes, sinful. There's going to be that separation between those two. And in James, the 2nd chapter, and in verse 26, James 2 and in the 26th verse, we can see a little bit more about that connection. We stated how the body apart from the spirit is, they are separated by when death does occur. But in verse 26 of James 2, it says, "For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." Our body cannot continue when this life comes to end and our spirit departs from it. It is no longer something that is able to carry on. And God is the one that decides when my spirit does leave my body, when my life here on earth does come to an end. But where does our spirit go? We see our bodies in the tomb or in the grave. Where's our spirit? Where's my soul? Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter, and in verse 7, gives answer to that. In Ecclesiastes 12 and in verse 7, notice what Solomon says regarding this idea. Ecclesiastes 12 and in the 7th verse, it reads, "Then dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." What did we say? That we established from Genesis 3 that dust we are, to dust we shall return, both all of us that are here tonight. When our life does come to an end, our bodies will decay. They will be no more. But yet that spirit, that inner man that we have within us currently, goes back to God. Fairly so. He's the one who gave it. We would want it to return. That's something that we should seek. Goes back to God, the one who placed it there originally. And it makes you think, I remember when we were a lot younger, we always had hermit crabs, which are really odd little creatures. Because during some times of the year, they go from shell to shell. And when they leave the shell that they were originally in, when they're gone out of it, the little shell doesn't have that inner crab inside of it anymore. And that shell's not moving. That shell's not going anywhere. There's no longer any life inside of it because the inner part, that important part that really was thriving, is gone. And in the same way, you can look at that with our bodies. When our spirit goes, when God decides that our time on earth is done, our body no longer has purpose. It's gone. But also we can see that where is man going? We're going to the judgment. In Hebrews, the 9th chapter, and in verse 27, we can read when this judgment occurs, when it's something that's going to take place. Hebrews 9, and in verse 27, the Hebrew writer says, he says here, "And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this, the judgment." So after death, that is when we are going to be judged. Well, what are we going to be judged upon? What is the criteria that we're going to be judged, whether pleasant or displeasing unto God? 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, and in 2 Corinthians 5 and in verse 10 tells us that we're going to have everything brought into account before God, before that judgment seat of Christ. And He is the one who's going to judge us if we did live pleasing in this life or if we lived a rather sinful life, one that is deserving of death. When we are judged by Christ, well, a lot of people say, how's that going to be fair? How's that going to be fair to me? Well, notice in John the 5th chapter and in verse 28. John 5 and in verse 28. John the 5th chapter and in the 28th verse. It says, "Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear His voice and come forth, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of death." We can see in this text, the body and the soul are going to be reunited on that last day, on that judgment day, when this world is going to be separated from the elements within it, and our bodies, our soul, they're going to be brought back together. But there's two different, it's the same resurrection here, but notice there's a separation between the people that are going to be judged. Some are going to that resurrection of life where they will be seen as those who did glorify God while their time here on earth. But yet there's a different case for some. There's condemnation. Resurrection of condemnation is left for those who failed to serve God, to where that purpose wasn't something that they carried out every day of their life. In 2 Thessalonians 1 in verse 8, notice what the Apostle Paul says here. 2 Thessalonians in the first chapter and in the 8th verse. The Apostle Paul says here, "In flaming fire taking vengeance on those who do not know God, and on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. These shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His power." If the gospel is not obeyed in your life, it's not something that you place a very strong importance upon, I would urge you to reconsider, because as the text says here, not only are you going to be destroyed, but we're not going to have God's presence looking upon us. And I think that's something that's very scary. I think that's something that we would want to think about. That we're going to be removed from the presence of God, that removed from the glory of His power, as the text says. That sounds very frightening. That doesn't sound like something that we would willingly want to have involved in our life. In Matthew the 10th chapter, and in verse 28, Jesus speaking here on the fear that we're speaking of a little bit, that goes along with this end of our lives. In Matthew 10 and in verse 28, He says here, "And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. But rather, fear Him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." There are people in this life that may be able to kill us based on our faith. But you know what's worse? One who can destroy both that inner part of man as well as the outward part. That can ruin my life and my chances to be reunited with God one day. But what's on the other side of that coin? When we are judged as one who has glorified God during our time here, we lived up to that standard, a manner of life worthy unto the gospel of Christ. What's our situation? What is it that we are hoping for, that we're longing for? We sing the song sometimes, "To Canaan's land I'm on my way, where the soul of man never dies." When we'll be reunited with God, when we have that home in heaven that is awaiting us, those that have loved His appearing, those that have taken the time out of their lives to think twice about our spirituality, about how we're going to serve Him, and if that's going to be something that's important to us in our life, we have a reward that's waiting for us. That we will be reunited with those who served Him faithfully, as well as God our Father who is in heaven. That's something that is very encouraging to think about. That's uplifting to think about, that that's what's waiting for us. That's something that is able for me to gain while I am here on earth. It's something we need to think about. Are you glorifying God today? God placed a spirit within our physical body, as well as a purpose for us being man as while we are here on earth. And that purpose is to glorify God, to keep His commandments, to uphold His statutes that He established. That has to be something that we live out in our lives. But there is going to come a time when our life here on earth will end. And when that does happen, we will be judged according to the words that Jesus spoke. We can read that in John 12 and verse 48. But how can I glorify God today? How can that be something that I'm able to do right now? If we're living a life that is dedicated to Him, it starts with my spirit on that inward man. To know what it is that is good from evil. To know what it is that I need to carry out in this life. And when I do know that, when I establish that as having an importance in my life, then it goes to my soul. And then I can passionately, I'm providing an energized manner of which I'm going to serve God. I'm going to carry out those tasks. As well as my body comes into place when I do finally fulfill what it is that goal is of serving God. All of these things come together, and we realize that it takes our total, our complete, entire man in order to serve God our Father. And should it be any other way? We think about how wonderful He is, that He had the power to create everything that we see here on earth. Why would it not be something that, why was that unfair, that it takes every ounce of us, every fiber within us to serve Him fully? It makes perfect sense. It's something that is very rational, but what can I do to be judged as one acceptable unto God? What did we read in Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter? To fear God and keep His commandments. For what? For this is man's all. This is our entire purpose. This is the reason that we are here. It's not some accident that some scholar may say it was, that it was just a big bang and man was here. No. God put us here with a purpose. We have a drive. We have a passion within us that we are going to serve God. And it needs to be something that we are translating into our lives that is happening. And when it is, then we're striving for that faith of the gospel. Think how serious it is if we don't obey God. If we don't obey the commandments that He provided to us in His Word, the words that Jesus spoke. If we don't generate that motion to serve God in our lives, if that's not something that we place a great priority and importance upon, then we're going to be separated from Him eternally. We read that. You remember what we read in 1 Thessalonians 1? How those that know God or do not know God and do not obey the gospel, that they are going to be lost. They're going to be taken up in a flaming fiery vengeance. Obeying that gospel takes every ounce of me, every ounce of my person to where I'm going to carry out, as well as living the life of a Christian is something that takes a lot of thinking and a lot of processing, a lot of work as well. But it's so very worth it. It's something that we should want to do, that we should be passionate about, that it's something we're going to take care of. It takes that whole being of me, but look what happens if I don't. It's the whole reason that we're here tonight, that we're going to serve God. You may ask the question, what do I have to do to serve God tonight? Well, have you been baptized for the remission of your sins? Have you been obedient to the gospel's call as it may usher us to do it? Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? That He died on Calvary's cruel cross and was raised again that third day for the remission of our sins? If you are willing to make that bold claim before us, and we would love to assist you, we would love to worship with you and to help you along this Christian walk. We can be an encouragement to one another. We can realize that this purpose with which we are here is to glorify God. Yeah. Why not have more people doing that together? Why not let us all encourage one another by seeing that we're all glorifying God, we're all serving Him? It may be the case that you've stumbled in your walk, that you haven't been living up to that standard that is worthy of the gospel of Christ, and you realize that you need to take action with that right now. We would love to assist you. Won't you come to the front while we stand and while we sing?